September 11, 2024, MetLife Stadium. Marcus Webb had been running stadium security for 3 years, but he'd been running from this moment for 23. 3 men, Middle Eastern, racing across the 50-yard line with a black bag during the national anthem, 60,000 people on their feet. Webb's radio crackled with panic calls from his team. His finger hovered over the emergency alert button. One press would lock down the stadium. One press would send tactical teams swarming the field. One press would destroy 3 more lives the way he'd destroyed 3 lives before. The crowd began to notice. Phones came out. Social media would explode in minutes. Webb closed his eyes and saw Ahmad Hassan's face. The man who died in federal custody because Marcus Webb had been so certain, so absolutely certain, that day in 2001. Now Ahmad's sons knelt at midfield. Opening the bag Webb thought held destruction. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The bag's contents scattered like snow across the artificial turf. Not explosives, not weapons. Ash. Gray, delicate ash that caught the September wind and danced toward the goalposts where Ahmad Hassan had once dreamed of playing professional football. Webb's knees buckled. 23 years collapsed into this single moment. The weight of his mistake, the echo of Ahmad's voice pleading innocence in that sterile interrogation room, the phone call at 3 a.m. telling him Ahmad had suffered a heart attack in custody. "Sir?" The voice crackled through his earpiece. "Do we move in?" Webb couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The 3 men, Ahmad's sons, he realized now, seeing their father's features reflected in their faces, remained kneeling as the ashes swirled around them. The eldest, maybe 35, whispered something in Arabic, a prayer, the same prayer Ahmad had recited during those final hours of questioning. The crowd's murmur grew louder. 60,000 people witnessing this moment, but none of them understanding its true weight. To them, it was just a disruption during the anthem. To Webb, it was justice finally arriving after 2 decades of running. His radio erupted again. Security breach on the field. Requesting immediate. Webb yanked out his earpiece. The tactical team would be here soon regardless. They'd swarm the field, weapons drawn, ready to repeat the same cycle of assumption and brutality that had destroyed the Hassan family once before. Unless he stopped them. His legs found their strength. Webb vaulted over the barrier separating the security booth from the field, his 58-year-old body protesting every step. Behind him, he heard his team shouting, calling for backup, following protocol he'd written himself, protocol designed to prevent exactly what he was about to do. The artificial turf felt spongy beneath his feet as he ran toward midfield. The 3 men hadn't moved, hadn't acknowledged the chaos building around them. They were lost in their ritual, in their grief, in a moment of connection with their father that Webb had stolen from them 23 years ago. The youngest son, barely 20, with Ahmad's gentle eyes, looked up as Webb approached. No fear in his expression, just resignation as if he'd been expecting this confrontation his entire life. "Your father," Webb said, his voice barely audible over the crowd noise. "Your father was Ahmad Hassan." The young man nodded slowly. "You remember." "I never forgot." Webb's service weapon felt heavy on his hip, a reminder of the authority he'd once wielded so carelessly. "I destroyed him. I destroyed your family." "You destroyed yourself too," the eldest son said, rising to his feet. Ash clung to his knees, his father's remains marking him like sacred dust. "We've been watching you, Mr. Webb. 3 years working security here. Every September 11th standing guard, waiting for ghosts." The truth hit Webb harder than any physical blow. They'd known he worked here, known he'd be watching when they came. This wasn't coincidence, it was orchestration. A careful, deliberate confrontation years in the making. Tactical officers breached the tunnel entrance, their black uniforms stark against the green field. Webb had minutes, maybe seconds, before they reached midfield. Before history repeated itself in the worst possible way. "The ashes," Webb said urgently. "Why here? Why now?" The middle son spoke for the first time, his voice carrying an accent Webb remembered from late-night interrogations. "Papa loved football, loved this stadium. He brought us here when we were children, before," he gestured at the spreading ash, Before you taught us that dreams weren't for people like us. Webb's radio crackled on his belt. Orders barked through static. Secure the subjects. Potential terrorist activity. Use necessary force. Necessary force. The same phrase that had echoed through Ahmad's final hours. The same justification that had turned suspicion into brutality, questions into accusations, detention into death. I can stop this, Webb said, his hand moving toward his radio. I can call them off. Can you? The eldest son's smile held no warmth. Can you really undo 23 years of fear? Can you change what you are? The tactical team was 50 yards away and closing fast. Their weapons weren't drawn yet, but Webb knew that would change the moment they reached speaking distance. The moment they saw 3 Middle Eastern men kneeling over scattered ash on September 11th, protocol would take over. Protocol he'd helped design in the aftermath of his failure with Ahmad. The weight of decision pressed down on Webb's shoulders like a physical force. He could step aside, let justice take its course, watch the Hassan family face the same fate that had claimed their father, or he could finally do what he should have done 23 years ago, stand between his past and his conscience, stand between fear and truth, stand between the badge and the men it was supposed to protect. The youngest Hassan's son looked up at Webb one more time, ash swirling around them both like snow that would never melt. Choose, he whispered. Webb's hand trembled as it hovered over his radio. The tactical team's boots thundered against the turf, 30 yards out now, their formation tight and purposeful. In that frozen moment between decision and action, his mind fractured, not forward to the consequences rushing toward them, but backward to the quiet life he'd built from the wreckage of his conscience. The small apartment in Queens. Sarah's reading glasses perched on the kitchen counter next to her morning crossword, half finished and abandoned when she'd left for her shift at the children's hospital. The way she touched his shoulder every night when the dreams came, never asking about the screaming, never pushing him to explain why he jolted awake at 3 a.m. calling Ahmad's name. 20 years of marriage to a woman who'd learned to love around the jagged edges of his guilt. Sir, step away from the subjects. The lead tactical officer's voice cut through the September air, sharp with authority Webb had once commanded himself. Webb's fingers found the radio clip. One word into that device, and this ended. The Hassan sons would spend the anniversary of their father's death in the same sterile interrogation rooms where Ahmad had drawn his last free breath. The cycle would continue, fed by the same fear Webb had nurtured in the dark years after September 11th, when suspicion became patriotism and questioning became betrayal. But Sarah would be safe. His pension would remain intact. The quiet routine they'd built, Saturday morning farmers markets, evening walks through Flushing Meadows, the way she hummed while doing dishes, would survive another day. The youngest Hassan son's eyes held no hatred, and somehow that made it worse. Webb had expected anger, had prepared for accusations. Instead, he saw recognition, the look of a man who understood that some choices arrived 23 years too late, wrapped in the echoes of decisions that had already destroyed everything they'd touched. Papa used to bring us here on Sundays, the middle son said, his voice carrying across the field as if the approaching tactical team didn't exist. Before the towers fell, before we learned what it meant to carry our father's name. He lifted a handful of ash, letting it slip between his fingers. He'd point to the end zone and say, "In America, even a boy from Damascus can score touchdowns." Webb's radio crackled. Sarah's hospital was probably releasing the morning shift soon. She'd drive home through Queens traffic, pick up groceries for the dinner they'd planned, salmon with the dill sauce she'd been perfecting for months. She'd set the table for 2, check the clock, wonder why he hadn't called, wonder if today was the day his past finally caught up to the life they'd built from its ashes. Movement on the field, all units converge. The tactical commander's voice boomed through megaphones now, amplified across the stadium where 60,000 people watched their quiet Sunday ritual unfold into chaos. 20 yards. Webb could see individual faces beneath the tactical visors, young faces, earnest faces, faces that trusted the intelligence he'd provide, faces that looked exactly like his own 23 years ago, when certainty felt like strength and questioning felt like weakness. The eldest Hassan's son stood slowly, ash coating his dark jacket like snow that wouldn't melt. You know what the hardest part was? Not Papa's death. We grieved him, we buried him, we moved forward. The hardest part was watching you on the news afterward, explaining how the system worked, how procedures kept America safe. His smile held no warmth, how sometimes innocent people had to suffer for the greater good. Webb's chest tightened. The interviews, the congressional hearings, the careful language his supervisors had coached him to use. Regrettable incident, necessary vigilance, lessons learned. Words that had built his career on Ahmad's grave, each promotion another shovelful of earth over the truth. Sarah's face appeared in his mind again. The way she'd looked at him across the breakfast table that morning, sunlight streaming through their kitchen window, making her graying hair shine like silver thread. "You seem different lately," she'd said, reaching across to touch his hand. "Lighter somehow, like you're finally ready to let something go." If only she'd known what letting go actually meant. The tactical team was 15 yards out. Webb could smell their tactical gear, leather and gun oil and the sharp scent of adrenaline. Behind them, stadium security poured onto the field like ants responding to a threat. The machine he'd helped design was working perfectly, grinding forward with mechanical precision toward another Ahmad Hassan, another family destroyed in the name of safety. Webb keyed his radio. Static filled the channel as 60,000 people leaned forward in their seats, as Sarah drove through Queens traffic humming the song from their wedding, as 3 sons knelt in their father's ashes and waited for justice that was 23 years overdue. "All units," Webb's voice cut through the chaos. "Stand down." The static erupted like a broken dam. Every voice on the tactical frequency hit Webb's ears at once. Confusion, anger, protocol demanding clarification of his order. But beneath the radio chatter, another sound cut through the September air, something that made Webb's blood freeze in recognition. His phone was ringing. Not the department-issued radio or the stadium security line. His personal cell phone, buzzing against his chest with the specific ringtone he'd assigned to only one number. Sarah's ringtone. The opening bars of The Way You Look Tonight, their wedding song from 1997. But Sarah was supposed to be at the hospital. Her shift didn't end for another 3 hours. Webb's hand moved automatically to his pocket as the tactical team hesitated 15 yards away, their formation wavering in the face of his stand-down order. The eldest Hassan's son watched him with those familiar eyes, Ahmad's eyes, as if he'd been expecting this exact moment. "Answer it," the young man said quietly. "She's been waiting to talk to you." The phone's screen showed Sarah's contact photo, her face laughing over birthday cake 6 months ago, gray hair caught in afternoon sunlight, completely unaware that her husband was a man who'd built 20 years of marriage on a foundation of buried bodies. Webb's thumb trembled over the answer button. "Sir, clarify your order." The tactical commander's voice boomed across the field. "Do we have a stand down or not?" Webb pressed the phone to his ear. "Sarah?" "Marcus." Her voice was different, flat, empty of the warmth that had sustained him through 2 decades of nightmares. "I'm at the hospital, watching you on television." The words hit him like a physical blow. Of course, the game was broadcast nationally. Every major network would be cutting to this scene. Former FBI agent Marcus Webb standing between tactical teams and 3 Middle Eastern men on September 11th. Sarah wasn't just watching her husband's career disintegrate in real time. She was watching the truth he'd hidden from her finally surface. "Sarah, I can explain." Ahmad Hassan died on September 18, 2001. Her voice carried the clinical precision she used with terminal patients, each word measured and final. 7 days after the towers fell, 7 days after you arrested him for suspicion of terrorism, 7 days before you came home and told me you'd had a difficult week at work. The middle Hassan's son rose to his feet, ash swirling around him like gray snow. "She knows, Mr. Webb. We sent her the files 3 days ago. Every document from Papa's case, every photograph from the detention facility, every medical report from his final hours." Webb's knees nearly buckled. "You contacted my wife?" "We contacted Ahmad Hassan's widow first," the eldest son said. "Our mother. She died 5 years ago, still believing America was a place where justice existed. We promised her grave that we'd find the man who killed Papa, that we'd make him face what he'd done." The phone pressed against Webb's ear felt like molten metal. Sarah's breathing was audible through the speaker, each exhale a countdown to the end of everything he'd tried to build from the wreckage of his conscience. 20 years, Marcus. Sarah's voice cracked for the first time. 20 years of watching you wake up screaming. 20 years of pretending I didn't see you counting pills, measuring out exactly how many it would take. 20 years of loving a ghost while the real you died in some interrogation room I was never supposed to know existed. Ma'am, we need instructions. The tactical commander was closer now, his weapon half raised, protocol and confusion warring in his voice. What are your orders? But Webb couldn't speak. The phone call had shattered something fundamental in his chest. Not just his marriage, not just his carefully constructed life, but the last thin barrier between the man he'd pretended to be and the truth Sarah had somehow always known. She'd loved him anyway. For 20 years, she'd loved the broken pieces of him anyway. The funeral is Tuesday, the youngest Hassan's son said, his voice carrying the weight of a family's 23-year journey toward this moment. Our father's real funeral, the one he should have had in 2001, surrounded by friends instead of federal agents. Sarah's voice returned through the phone, steady now with the finality of a diagnosis she'd been avoiding. I'll be home tonight to pack. Dr. Reeves is covering my patients. I think I need to stay with my sister for a while. The line went dead. Webb stared at the phone's dark screen as ash continued to swirl around them, as 60,000 people watched his world collapse in real time, as tactical officers waited for orders from a man who'd just lost everything that had made following orders worthwhile. The past hadn't just returned. It had been waiting, patient and methodical, orchestrating this moment when all his careful lies would finally crumble into the same ash that coated the Hassan family's hands. There was no going back now. There was only the choice between the man he'd been and the man he'd destroyed, 23 years too late. The dead phone felt like a stone in Webb's palm. Around him, the world fractured into fragments, tactical boots grinding against artificial turf, radio static crackling with increasingly urgent demands, 60,000 voices rising from the stands like a tide he could no longer hold back. But all Webb could hear was the dial tone's monotonous buzz, the sound of 20 years dissolving into electronic silence. His legs buckled, not dramatically, just a slight wobble that forced him to catch himself, the kind of weakness that comes when a man realizes the ground beneath his feet was never solid at all. The Hassan sons watched him with something that wasn't quite sympathy, recognition maybe. The look of men who'd spent decades watching someone else's foundation crumble while their own had been ash all along. Sir, I need a clear directive. The tactical commander's voice cut through the haze, sharp with the kind of authority Webb had once wielded like a weapon. Do we engage or stand down? Webb tried to speak, but his throat had closed around Sarah's final words. I think I need to stay with my sister for a while. 20 years of marriage reduced to logistics. 20 years of shared dinners, quiet conversations, the way she'd trace circles on his back when the nightmares came, all of it packed into a single sentence that meant everything they'd built was already gone. The youngest Hassan's son stepped closer. Up close, he looked even more like Ahmad, the same gentle slope to his shoulders, the same patient way of holding his head when faced with authority. She's a good woman, your wife. When we sent her the files, she cried, not for herself, for Papa, for us, for what you'd been carrying alone. You had no right. Webb's voice cracked like thin ice. We had every right. The eldest son's words carried the weight of 23 years. Papa had a wife too, had sons who waited for him to come home, had a family that spent 2 decades wondering if they could have done something different, said something different, been something different to keep him alive. Behind them, Webb heard the mechanical click of safeties being disengaged. The tactical team was losing patience, and their training was taking over. He recognized the sound, had heard it in a dozen operations where hesitation meant casualties, where thinking too long meant someone else made the decision for you. In about 30 seconds, Webb's internal struggle would become irrelevant. The machine would grind forward whether he guided it or not. His radio erupted with cross-chatter. 3 different voices demanding updates, clarification, some kind of leadership from a man who'd just watched his last anchor to normalcy snap free and drift away. Through the chaos, one voice cut through with familiar authority. Webb, "What's your status?" Deputy Chief Morrison, Webb's former partner from the counter-terrorism unit, the man who'd sat across from him in a dozen debriefings, helping craft the language that had turned Ahmad's death into bureaucratic necessity. Morrison's voice carried undertones that made Webb's skin crawl, not concern for the situation but for what this moment might mean for both their carefully buried secrets. "Status is—" Webb started, then stopped. What was his status? Married man becoming divorced? Agent becoming civilian? Truth-teller becoming honest for the first time in 23 years? Status is complicated. Negative. Status is simple. 3 suspects on the field. Potential terrorist activity. Clear and present danger. Follow protocol. Protocol. The word tasted like metal in Webb's mouth. Protocol had killed Ahmad Hassan. Protocol had turned suspicion into certainty, questions into accusations, a detained man into a dead one. Protocol was the machinery that had ground up a family and spit out the career Webb had built from the pieces. The middle Hassan son was spreading more ashes, working with methodical precision despite the weapons trained in his direction. Papa used to tell us stories about playing football at university in Damascus, how the field felt under his feet, how the crowd sounded when someone scored. He said American football was different, more violent, more honest. You couldn't hide what you were under all that equipment. Webb's hand moved to his service weapon, muscle memory from decades of training. But instead of drawing it, he found himself unclipping the holster completely. The weight of it in his hands felt heavier than it should have. Not just metal and leather, but every decision he'd made while wearing it. Every moment he'd chosen authority over humanity. "Webb, respond." Morrison's voice carried an edge of panic now. "Are you compromised?" Compromised. Another word that tasted wrong. Webb had been compromised for 23 years, living a life built on the corpse of his conscience, loving a woman with hands that had blood on them she'd never been allowed to see. This wasn't compromise. This was the opposite. This was the first uncompromised moment he'd experienced since September 18, 2001. The tactical team was 10 yards out. Webb could see the lead officer's eyes behind his visor. Young, certain, ready to do what needed doing. Ready to follow the protocol Webb had helped write in the aftermath of his own failure to see Ahmad Hassan as human. The choice was simple now. Step aside and watch history repeat itself. Or finally become the man Sarah had somehow loved despite everything he'd hidden from her. Webb dropped his weapon onto the artificial turf where it landed with a soft thud, like everything else in his life that had once seemed permanent. The tactical team stopped dead. Not gradually, all at once, like a film suddenly paused. The lead officer's weapon wavered as he processed what he'd just witnessed, a federal agent dropping his sidearm in the middle of an active incident. Protocol had no contingency for this. Training manuals didn't cover supervisors abandoning their post to kneel beside the enemy. Because that's what Webb was doing now. Kneeling in the ashes of Ahmad Hassan, his pressed security uniform collecting gray dust like evidence of crimes that could no longer be hidden. "Webb," Morrison's voice through the radio had shifted from authority to something approaching terror. "What the hell are you doing?" Webb picked up a handful of ash. It felt lighter than he'd expected, softer, more like talcum powder than the gritty remains he'd imagined. This was what was left of a man who'd dreamed of touchdowns in Damascus, who'd brought his sons to this very stadium on Sunday afternoons before the world taught them to fear their father's name, Marcus. The eldest Hassan's son's voice was quiet, meant only for him. "Do you want to know what really happened in that room?" The question hung in the September air like smoke from a distant fire. Webb had read the reports, of course, had written some of them himself. Suspect became agitated during questioning. Suspect resisted detention procedures. Suspect suffered cardiac episode during routine interrogation. Medical intervention unsuccessful. Clean language, bureaucratic language, language that turned a man's death into paperwork and a family's grief into classified files. The coroner's report was altered, the middle son said, still spreading ashes with ritual precision. "We have the original, defensive wounds, fractured ribs, hemorrhaging consistent with repeated blunt trauma." Webb's hands began to shake. The ash slipped between his fingers like water, like time, like everything he'd convinced himself he could control. No. We followed procedure. I followed. You left the room. The youngest son's voice was gentle, almost forgiving. Our investigation found the logs. Agent Webb departed interrogation room 7 at 14:22 hours. Returned at 16:15 hours, 1 hour and 53 minutes. The math hit him like physical force. Nearly 2 hours unaccounted for. 2 hours he'd blocked from memory so completely that even now, facing the truth, his mind recoiled from what those missing minutes contained. But fragments were returning. The way Ahmad had looked when Webb left, frightened but unharmed, asking about his sons, asking when he could call his wife. And then, nothing. A black hole in Webb's recollection, followed by his return to find Ahmad unconscious, blood on the table, other agents standing over the body with the satisfied exhaustion of men who'd gotten results. You weren't there when it happened, the eldest son continued, but you covered for the men who were. You wrote the reports that buried the truth. You testified before Congress that Ahmad Hassan died of natural causes while in federal custody. Webb's radio exploded with competing voices. Morrison screaming for status updates, the tactical commander demanding orders, stadium security coordinating crowd control as 60,000 people watched their quiet September afternoon transform into the kind of news event that would dominate headlines for weeks. But beneath all the chaos, Webb heard something else. His phone buzzing again. A text message this time, from Sarah. The photos were the worst part, seeing what they did to him. Seeing your signature on every document that said it never happened. I keep trying to understand how the man I married became someone who could live with that. How the man who cries during dog food commercials could bury another human being so completely. Webb stared at the screen until the words blurred. Sarah hadn't just learned about Ahmad's death. She'd seen the evidence, had spent 3 days studying crime scene photographs, medical reports, witness statements that had been sealed for 23 years, had watched her husband's carefully constructed heroism dissolve into the ugliest kind of complicity. The tactical team was advancing again. Someone higher up the chain had made a decision that Webb was no longer capable of making. In 30 seconds, maybe less, the Hassan sons would be face down on artificial turf with plastic zip ties around their wrists, and history would repeat itself with the kind of mechanical precision that had made Webb's career possible. There's something else, the middle son said, his voice carrying a strange note of urgency. Something we haven't told you yet. Webb looked up from his phone, ash coating his hands like guilt made visible. Papa didn't die in detention. The words came out flat, factual, devastating. He died 3 days later, in the hospital, alone. We were never notified, never got to say goodbye, never got to tell him we forgave him for bringing us to a country that would kill him for existing. The ground beneath Webb's knees felt like it was dissolving. Not just the marriage, not just the career, but the fundamental understanding of cause and effect that had let him sleep at night for 23 years. Ahmad Hassan had been alive, had been conscious, had spent his final hours wondering why his sons never came to see him. The revelation hit Webb like a physical blow, doubling him over until his forehead nearly touched the artificial turf. 3 days. Ahmad Hassan had survived 3 days in a hospital bed, tubes and monitors keeping him tethered to a life that federal bureaucracy had already written off as concluded. The hospital records show he was conscious for most of it, the eldest son continued, his voice carrying the clinical detachment of someone who'd memorized every medical detail. Asking for his family, asking why no one came. The nurses said he kept saying our names, Kareem, Rashid, Yusuf, like a prayer. Webb's vision blurred, not from tears, something deeper than that. A fundamental reorganization of reality that made the stadium lights seem too bright, the crowd noise too distant. For 23 years he'd carried the weight of a man's death, but the truth was worse than death. He'd carried the weight of abandonment. You signed the notification waiver. Yusuf, the youngest, said quietly. Document 447C. Family contact deemed unnecessary pending security review. You personally ensured we never knew Papa was dying. The words triggered something buried so deep in Webb's memory that accessing it felt like archaeological excavation. A conference room in Lower Manhattan, smoke still visible through the windows, everyone speaking in the clipped tones of people trying to maintain control while their world burned. Morrison had pushed the form across the table. Routine paperwork, he'd said. Operational security. Can't have enemy sympathizers clustering around hospitals causing scenes. Webb had signed it without reading, had trusted the system he'd sworn to serve. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Sarah, but he couldn't look, couldn't bear to see his marriage dissolve in real time, while 60,000 people watched and television cameras broadcast his personal apocalypse to a nation that would spend the next week debating whether he was hero or villain. "Sir," the tactical commander's voice cut through Webb's spiral, "I'm calling this in 30 seconds, with or without your authorization." But Webb was no longer thinking about protocols or chain of command. He was thinking about Ahmad Hassan lying in a hospital bed, watching the door for sons who would never come, asking nurses if there had been any word from his family, if someone had called, if perhaps the phones weren't working because of all the chaos in the city. What were his last words? Webb heard himself ask. The three brothers exchanged glances. Rashid, the middle son, reached into his jacket, the same motion that had triggered this entire confrontation, and withdrew a manila envelope. From it, he pulled a single sheet of paper, hospital letterhead visible even from Webb's position. The attending physician documented everything, Rashid said. "Papa thought we'd abandoned him, thought we'd decided he was guilty and turned our backs. He died believing his sons were ashamed of him." Webb's hands pressed against the turf hard enough to leave impressions. The truth was reforming around him like broken glass reassembling itself into a window he could finally see through clearly. Ahmad Hassan hadn't just died from his injuries, he'd died from isolation, from the systematic severing of every human connection that might have given him reason to fight for recovery. The notification waiver wasn't routine paperwork, it was a weapon, a way of ensuring that inconvenient men died quietly, without witnesses, without family members asking difficult questions about defensive wounds and altered medical records. Morrison's voice crackled through the radio again, but now Webb could hear the panic beneath the authority. "Webb, you need to contain this situation immediately. There are reporters present. This is becoming a public relations nightmare." Public relations. Not a human tragedy or a moral reckoning, but a communications problem. Webb realized he was hearing Morrison clearly for the first time in 23 years. Not as a colleague or mentor, but as the architect of a cover-up that had required Webb's silence to survive. "He kept a photo of you boys," Webb said suddenly, the memory surfacing without warning. "In his wallet." When they processed his personal effects, there was a picture, 3 kids at a baseball game. You were wearing Yankees caps. Kareem's composure finally cracked. "We went to Yankee Stadium for his birthday in 1998. Papa said American baseball was poetry, but football was where a man showed his true character." The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Ahmad Hassan's sons had chosen this football field, this September afternoon, to reveal their father's true character to the man who'd helped bury it. They'd turned Webb's own territory into the site of his judgment. The tactical team was moving again, but Webb no longer cared. Let them come. Let the cameras roll and the headlines write themselves. Sarah was already gone, his career was already over, and the careful architecture of lies that had supported his life for 2 decades was already rubble. All that remained was the choice between continuing to serve the machine that had killed Ahmad Hassan, or finally becoming the man who might have saved him. Webb stood slowly, ash falling from his clothes like gray snow, and faced the approaching officers with empty hands and a conscience that was finally devastatingly clear. The tactical officers froze mid-stride as Webb raised both hands, palms open, fingers spread wide against the September sky. But he wasn't surrendering. He was making himself into a human shield between the Hassan brothers and the weapons trained on them. "Stand down," Webb called out, his voice carrying across the field with the authority of 23 years in federal service. "I'm ordering a tactical stand-down." "Negative." Morrison's voice exploded through the radio, no longer bothering with professional courtesy. "Webb, you are relieved of command. Step aside immediately or face arrest for obstruction." Webb reached down and switched off his radio. The silence that followed felt like stepping out of a hurricane into the eye of the storm. Around him, The stadium held its breath. 60,000 people sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that would be replayed and analyzed and debated long after the game they'd come to watch was forgotten. Behind him, Yusuf was finishing the last of the ash, scattering it across the 30-yard line where Ahmad Hassan had dreamed his father might have scored touchdowns. The ritual was nearly complete, but Webb understood now that completion wasn't the point. The point was witness. The point was forcing him to see what his silence had cost. "Your wife asked us not to do this," Kareem said quietly. "When we contacted her, she begged us to let sleeping dogs lie. Said destroying your life wouldn't bring Papa back." Webb's chest tightened. Even after seeing the photographs, even after learning the depth of his complicity, Sarah had tried to protect him, had chosen mercy over justice, love over truth, the man she'd married over the man he'd proven himself to be. "But Yusuf disagreed," Rashid continued, gesturing toward his youngest brother. "He said Papa died believing we'd abandoned him. Said that lie needed to be answered with truth, no matter the cost." Webb looked at Yusuf, 26 years old, the same age Ahmad would have been when he first came to America, seeking a better life for his unborn children. The boy's hands were empty now, the last of his father's remains absorbed into artificial turf that would be watered and groomed and played upon by other men's sons. "He's right," Webb said, his voice barely audible over the crowd noise. "Your father deserved better. You all did." The tactical team commander was speaking into his helmet mic, requesting guidance from levels of authority Webb could no longer pretend to represent. In the corporate boxes above, stadium executives were probably deciding whether to evacuate, postpone the game, or simply wait for the disruption to resolve itself through the application of overwhelming force. But Webb's attention had narrowed to something much smaller and more immediate. His phone was buzzing again, not a text this time, but a call. Sarah's name on the screen like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. He almost didn't answer. What could he say that wouldn't make everything worse? How could he explain that their marriage had been built on a foundation of lies so fundamental that removing them would collapse everything they'd built together? But the phone kept ringing, and the Hassan brothers kept watching, and the tactical officers kept waiting for orders that would never come from him again. Webb answered on the 5th ring. "Marcus." Sarah's voice was smaller than he'd ever heard it, transmitted through digital compression and 23 years of accumulated deception. "I'm watching this on television. The whole country is watching this. I know. They're saying you've gone rogue, that you're having some kind of breakdown." Webb looked down at his ash-stained hands, his discarded weapon, his radio switched off and authority abandoned. Maybe they're right. "No." Sarah's voice carried sudden strength, the tone she used when arguing cases in front of skeptical judges. "They're not right. This isn't a breakdown. This is the first honest thing you've done in our entire marriage." The words hit him harder than any accusation could have. Not anger, not betrayal, but recognition. Sarah understood, perhaps better than he did, that this moment wasn't about destroying his life, but about finally starting to live it truthfully. "I don't know what happens now," he admitted. "Neither do I. But Marcus, whatever you do next, make sure it's something Ahmad Hassan's sons can live with. Make sure it's something you can live with." The line went dead, leaving Webb alone with the weight of impossible choices. Around him, the machinery of law enforcement was grinding forward, preparing to resolve this situation through the same systematic application of force that had killed Ahmad Hassan 23 years ago. But for the first time since September 18, 2001, Webb knew exactly what he had to do. He knelt back down in the ashes of Ahmad Hassan, picked up his service weapon, and began walking toward the tactical team with his hands raised and his badge extended like a white flag of surrender. The climax was no longer approaching. It had arrived, and Webb was finally ready to meet it honestly. Webb's footsteps echoed across the artificial turf as he approached the tactical line, each step feeling like crossing decades instead of yards. The officers watched him advance with the wary confusion of soldiers whose commanding officer had suddenly begun speaking in enemy language. His badge caught the September sunlight, no longer a symbol of authority but evidence of a system that had broken down completely. "Agent Webb, halt!" The tactical commander's voice carried the sharp edge of someone whose carefully planned operation had devolved into something unprecedented. "Drop your weapon and assume a defensive position!" But Webb kept walking, his service pistol held by the barrel, grip extended toward the officers like an offering. Behind him, the Hassan brothers remained motionless, their father's ashes now part of the field where 60,000 people bore witness to the collision of past and present. "I'm not the threat here," Webb called out, his voice carrying across the stadium with surprising clarity. "I never was. The threat is what we become when we stop seeing people as human beings." Morrison's replacement had arrived. Webb could see him in the command booth, speaking rapidly into multiple phones while pointing at the field. Deputy Director Carlson, a man who'd built his career on the foundation that Webb had helped construct. A man who understood that this moment threatened not just one operation, but the entire narrative that had justified 23 years of identical operations. Webb's phone vibrated one final time. A text from Sarah. The nurses said Ahmad kept asking if his sons were proud of him. Right until the end. The words stopped Webb 20 feet from the tactical line. Pride. Ahmad Hassan had died wondering if his children were proud of him, never knowing that they'd spent 2 decades fighting to clear his name, to prove his innocence, to honor the man who'd brought them to America seeking nothing more than opportunity. "Your father would be proud," Webb said, turning back toward the brothers. His voice carried across the field, amplified by the stadium's acoustics until every person present could hear. "Not just of what you've accomplished, but of how you've chosen to honor his memory. No violence, no revenge, just truth." Yusuf looked up from where he knelt, his hands still stained with ash. "Papa always said America was a place where truth mattered more than power, where justice was possible for everyone." The simplicity of that faith hit Webb harder than any accusation. Ahmad Hassan had believed in the America that Webb had sworn to protect, a country where innocence meant something, where due process wasn't just procedure but sacred trust, where death in federal custody required explanation rather than cover-up. Webb had failed that America as completely as he'd failed Ahmad Hassan. The tactical officers were growing restless, their training warring with the unprecedented nature of the situation. You couldn't assault an unarmed federal agent on national television, but you also couldn't allow operational authority to dissolve into philosophical discussion on a football field. That's when Webb made his choice. He placed his weapon on the turf, his badge beside it, and his radio next to both. Then he walked past the tactical line, past the confused officers, past the command structure that had defined his entire adult life. "Agent Webb," Morrison's voice exploded from someone else's radio. "You are in direct violation of federal orders. Return to your position immediately." Webb kept walking until he reached the 50-yard line, where a sideline reporter thrust a microphone toward him with the instinct of someone who recognized history in the making. "Agent Webb, can you explain what's happening here?" Webb looked directly into the camera, knowing that his words would reach Sarah, would reach Ahmad's sons, would reach a country that deserved better than the version of justice he'd helped deliver for 23 years. 23 years ago, I participated in a cover-up that cost an innocent man his life," he said, his voice steady despite everything collapsing around him. "Ahmad Hassan died in federal custody, and his family was denied even the chance to say goodbye. Today, his sons came here not to commit terrorism, but to honor their father's memory in the place he loved most." The reporter's eyes widened as she realized she was recording a confession that would dominate news cycles for months. "The real terrorism," Webb continued, "was what we did to that family, what we did to the truth, what we did to ourselves when we decided that fear justified anything." Behind him, the Hassan brothers had risen from the turf, their ritual complete. They made no attempt to flee, knowing that their purpose had been accomplished. They'd forced the truth into daylight, onto national television, into the conscience of a man who'd spent 2 decades in darkness. Webb felt something he hadn't experienced since September 18, 2001, the weight of truth instead of lies, justice instead of expediency, honor instead of survival. The tactical team finally moved, but they were no longer pursuing terrorists. They were arresting a federal agent who'd chosen conscience over career, 3 sons who'd chosen love over hatred, and the ghosts of America's own abandoned principles. As the handcuffs clicked closed around Webb's wrists, He realized that this wasn't his downfall. It was his redemption. The handcuffs felt lighter than Webb had expected. As the officers guided him toward the tunnel, he caught one last glimpse of the field where Ahmad Hassan's ashes now mixed with artificial turf and autumn sunlight. 23 years of weight had lifted from his shoulders, replaced by something he'd almost forgotten existed: peace. The booking process blurred together. Fingerprints, photographs, the reading of rights he'd administered to countless others. The federal holding facility in Lower Manhattan felt familiar in all the wrong ways, its corridors echoing with the same institutional emptiness that had swallowed Ahmad Hassan in 2001. But Webb wasn't afraid. Fear required uncertainty, and for the first time in decades, he knew exactly who he was. His cell had a narrow window facing north. If he pressed his face against the glass and looked west, he could almost see the stadium where everything had finally unraveled. The evening news played on a television mounted beyond his reach, his confession looping endlessly between commentary about governmental accountability and speculation about his mental state. Sarah came on the third day. She looked smaller in the visiting room's harsh fluorescent lighting, older than the woman he'd married, aged by truths he'd never shared and lies she'd never questioned. The phone trembled slightly in her hand as she sat across from him, separated by glass that might as well have been centuries. "The house is surrounded by reporters," she said without preamble. "They want to know if I had any knowledge of your involvement in the Hassan case." "What did you tell them?" "The truth. That I married a man who disappeared in September 2001, and I've been living with his ghost ever since." Webb pressed his palm against the glass. Sarah didn't mirror the gesture. The space between them contained 23 years of missed connections, of conversations that had skirted around the hole in their marriage's center, of a love that had survived on lies for so long it had forgotten how to live on truth. "I'm filing for divorce," she continued, her voice steady as closing arguments. "Not because of what you did, Marcus, because of what you didn't do. Every day for 23 years you chose silence over honesty, chose protecting Morrison over protecting us." The papers arrived the following week, along with news that the Hassan brothers had been released without charges. Their testimony before Congress was scheduled for the next month. Morrison had taken early retirement, his pension intact, his reputation manageable, damaged. The system was healing itself around the wound Webb had opened, minimizing the disruption, containing the fallout. But Ahmad Hassan was still dead, and Webb was still accountable. Trial lasted 8 months. Federal charges for civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to violate due process. Webb's attorney, court-appointed after Sarah's departure, had left him unable to afford private counsel, argued for leniency based on his decades of service and the extraordinary circumstances following 9/11. Webb rejected the plea deal. On the witness stand, he told the complete truth about September 18, 2001, about signing forms without reading them, about choosing career over conscience, about watching Ahmad Hassan die in isolation while his sons waited in a detention center, prevented by Webb's signature from saying goodbye. The prosecutor asked why he'd remained silent for 23 years. "Because admitting the truth meant admitting I wasn't the man I thought I was," Webb answered. "It meant accepting that I'd participated in something I'd spent my entire career fighting against. It was easier to live with lies than to face what those lies had cost." The verdict was guilty on all counts. 15 years in federal prison, eligible for parole in 10. Webb felt nothing but relief. Federal Correctional Institution Otisville had a library where Webb spent most of his time, helping younger inmates prepare for their GED exams and reading books about restorative justice and reconciliation. The work felt honest in a way that law enforcement never had, focused on building rather than breaking, on healing rather than punishment. Ahmad Hassan's sons visited once, 3 years into his sentence. They brought photographs. Ahmad as a young man in Damascus, learning English from American textbooks. Ahmad at his citizenship ceremony, hand over heart, tears in his eyes. Ahmad at Yankee Stadium with his boys, wearing the cap Kareem had described, smiling at a future he'd never lived to see. "We forgive you," Yusuf said simply. "Papa wouldn't want us to carry hatred. It would dishonor his memory." Webb accepted their forgiveness with the same humility he'd learned to apply to everything else. It wasn't absolution. Ahmad Hassan was still dead, Webb's marriage was still destroyed, and 23 years of silence couldn't be undone. But it was grace, offered freely by the people who had every right to withhold it. Walking back to his cell that evening, Webb thought about Sarah, now remarried to a colleague who'd never signed notification waivers or chosen expediency over truth. He thought about Morrison, enjoying retirement with his pension intact. He thought about the system that had created them both and continued functioning without them. But mostly he thought about Ahmad Hassan, who had died believing his sons were ashamed of him, and how love had transcended even that devastating lie. Some stories didn't have happy endings. Some had something better, honest ones. Webb had finally learned the difference.